being able to predict how hard students will find exam questions is something of a holy grail for assessment researchers. Experts are generally notoriously bad at it. Students find all sorts of things difficult that we don't anticipate. And I thought being able to describe some of the biases in judgments about this task might be helpful for you as teachers. So for GCSEs and A-levels, we rely on senior examiners to try and judge how hard students will find questions. There's some very limited pre-testing that is done, but it's not a full pre-testing system like you have, for example, in key stage assessments. Pre-testing in a qualification system that's as large and complex as ours would be incredibly expensive, and pre-testing in itself is pretty problematic in all sorts of ways. So we're left with this system where senior examiners are trying their best to construct exam papers that are going to be of the same level of difficulty from one year to the next. Exam papers that have to differentiate across the whole range of ability. And that means that sometimes they're more demanding and sometimes they're less demanding than we anticipate, and we have to adjust grade boundaries from one year to the next to try and compensate for that, to set a level playing field. So why can't senior examiners just get it right? Why can't they set papers of the right level of difficulty from one year to the next? Well, the answer is that just like us, they're humans, and they're humans making judgments that we know from the research literature are incredibly difficult to make. Human judgment is both inaccurate and biased, and experts can be just as prone to these biases as lay people. This way of kind of thinking about things has been really massively popularised by books like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I don't know if folks have read that. Excellent book. When I did my psychology degree, that was all new breaking academic stuff, and now it's very much in the way people talk about judgment. Another fantastic book on this, by the way, is Donald Laming's Human Judgment in the Eye of the Beholder. That's a lovely book that talks about the psychological literature about how people make judgments, but also goes through particular areas, including examining, but also social care and that kind of area, and shows how we've made mistakes in judgment over the years and how that can be explained by the literature on how we make judgments. I've also included on slides some more technical papers on the way in which examiners struggle to predict how difficult questions will be. There's also some evidence about how we can improve expert judgment, in particular in figuring out how hard questions will be. And that tends to show that absolute judgments are weaker than relative judgments, and I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, and that pooled judgments, so getting lots of judges together, are better than individual judgments or getting a few examiners to make a judgment. Okay, there we go. So the two studies that we're going to draw upon to talk about bias were studies that we did to support the accreditation process. So in accreditation, some of you probably know this, exam boards have to submit to Ofqual their specifications, and alongside that they include assessment strategies that set out how they're going to set about assessing maths and science in this instance, and they submit sample assessment materials too. And the idea is that panels of subject experts scrutinise these specifications, they scrutinise the assessment plans and sample assessment materials, and they try to come to a judgment as to whether the specification is likely to produce valid assessments, and whether the assessments are likely to be of the right level of demand and differentiate between students of different levels of ability. Now, we know from the research literature that we're setting our accreditation panels a really tough job. Estimating whether those SAMs are going to be of the right level of difficulty in the absence of students having actually sat them is really tough. So for GCSE Maths and GCSE Science, we collected some additional research data, and we're doing the same now for A-level mathematics, which is coming in for accreditation pretty much now. So we're rerunning these studies, so it'll be interesting to see what we find in terms of bias there as well. Now, in both of the studies, we were looking at expert judgments of how difficult questions were going to be, but we also had data about how hard students actually found them. So in the case of GCSE Maths, we'd actually already accredited the GCSE Maths specifications, but teachers raised a lot of concern about differences in the demand of the different exam board question papers. And we conducted quite a big programme of research to try and get under the surface of that and find out whether there was a concern. And in doing so, we actually had students sit the sample assessment materials. So we had estimates, and Steve's going to talk about the method by which we collected them, of how difficult students were likely to find the items, and then we had actual hard data as to how hard they really found them. And similarly in GCSE Science, in this case, we actually ran this study prior to accreditation. We learned from our maths experiences, collected the data ahead so that we could feed it into the accreditation process. And again, we had estimates of how hard our judges thought that items actually from the current exams as well as the SAMs would be, and actual difficulty of the items from current exams. So we could measure the gap between the estimates and actual difficulty. Anybody know who he is? So this is one of the original researchers in this area who in essence said absolute judgment is a bad idea, we're not very good at it at all, but comparative judgment works much better. So Thurston, working in the 20s, pioneered this idea. And he also pointed out that actually we don't really ever make absolute judgments. They're all kind of inherently comparative anyway. To illustrate this, we have a gratuitous cat picture. So how heavy is the cat? Any expert cat weighers in the room? Anybody want to make a guess?
2.7 kilograms.
Not bad, I reckon. Going off that.
Or you always talk about more when they're sitting in your head.
Yeah, I'll go along with that. Which is the heavier cat? That is one big cat, actually, when you see it in that context. I think he might be a Maine Coon, actually. So, just to illustrate the point. And my other example for this is always wine. So, you know, ask me to estimate how dry a glass of wine is. I might struggle. Give me 2 glasses. I'll be very good and consistent in my judgment over time. I can demonstrate this later to anybody who's interested.